Hi folks, thank you so much. Welcome to what I promise will be a thought-provoking presentation. And let's start with a test. Imagine you're Lucifer. It's a horrible test. Your goal is to corrupt humanity. Your goal is to lead God's creations made in His image, something that you find deeply offensive, to evil. Let me ask you a question and think about this for a second. How would you practically go about that? Would you present them with evil and hope that the concept would sell itself? It may work in individual cases. It may even work for the duration of a single generation. But what tends to happen is that the next generation views the wreckage and to some degree morally corrects for it. So how? How do you corrupt people on a long-term, ongoing basis if indeed that is your goal? The answer is not to present them with evil. It is to present them with a duplicitous version of good. You have to give them counterfeit morality. Welcome to the modern world of political correctness, a project some 300 years in the making. The image that you see on the screen was taken from just last year. This is a mob of young people confronting a woman. There she is, sitting at a restaurant, minding her own business. The mob confronts her, they scream in her face, and they demand that she lift the fist in solidarity with the politically correct cause. What gives me goosebumps is the fact that this particular woman refused to do that in the face of the mob. But for most human beings alive today, that is an extraordinarily difficult thing to do. It is much easier to go along with the mob, and even more so when the mob presents its cause as social justice, as something inherently good. Today I hope to persuade you that this is a counterfeit morality and that it is possibly the single most dangerous ideology that we face in our generation, and that if we don't prevail against it, we will hand a new dark age to our children. A dark age is simply defined as the inability of a generation to transmit its values, the pillars upholding a society, to the next generation. If we lose that ability, we are in trouble. In 1953, there was a Polish writer, poet, and Nobel laureate by the name of Czesław Miłosz, and he wrote a book called The Captive Mind. He points out something interesting that he saw firsthand, living in Poland under Soviet domination. Here's what happened before the Iron Curtain fell. Moscow would send out delegates, representatives trained in dialectic materialism, which is the underpinning philosophy of Marxist communism. And they would send them out to what we would today call a series of town hall meetings. And what would happen is that this agent would stand up on the stage quite openly in front of everyone, the town, the village gathered around, and he would deliver the new message of Marxism, the salvation of humanity. And people would openly object to it. And what he would do, because he was this well trained, is he would take apart, he would deconstruct every one of their arguments one by one, until the entire village was left, leaving this hall with the sense of, well, why shouldn't we just give up our culture? He points out that when you surrender your culture to an aggressive ideology, you win a new dark age for your children. And it's precisely what happened in Poland. Nevertheless, Poland was, of course, conquered militarily, but how much easier was it to accomplish that when the people were mentally and spiritually disarmed in advance? What if we're facing a similar challenge today? Is there an aggressive, usurping force trying to tear down our philosophy, the underpinnings of our entire civilization, the Judaeo-Christian tradition? My goal is to show you today not only that there is such a force, but in fact that it has made great headway, and we need to know how to prevail against it. If we leave the town hall having failed to dismantle their arguments, we surrender our culture and we surrender the next generation to darkness. We can't allow that to happen. So, folks, can you be a politically correct Christian? It's an interesting question. Well, we will look at political correctness from several points of view. And I know for many of you here today, your gut reaction to what I'm saying is already somewhat hostile, and that's okay. I'm here to persuade you. You're asking questions like, isn't political correctness just kindness? Isn't it just about inclusivity? Isn't it about creating a nicer society for all human beings? And aren't those Judeo-Christian values? I remind you once again, you can't present the people with evil. You have to present them with a duplicitous ideology that looks good. Something that sounds good to man, but the ends thereof are death. That is how the ideology works. So, at the most simple level, can you be a politically correct Christian? Well, the very term political correctness means to be correct, morally aligned, correct according to politics and according to politicians. Does that sound like a Christian virtue to you? We will go further and we will look at the origins of political correctness. Most people remain blissfully unaware of how this entire project started. The very first instance of the usage of the phrase politically correct, scholars have traced it back to 1921, 1922, where it was first used in a government publication in Soviet Russia. That's where the term comes from. This was something along the lines of Pravda, a government ideology and propaganda style publication, and that was the very first usage of this phrase, and it was used as something to aspire to. It was a good thing to be politically correct, as they lived in their socialist Marxist utopia. Now, we're actually going to go back a step and ask, how did this come about? Because although that's the first usage of the phrase politically correct, the origins go further back than that. We trace them to a man who is often called the original liberal, and his name is Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Now, we will define some of the terms as we go along. I am very happy with the term classical liberal. We distinguish that from progressive liberal, and I'll show you how this works. So, what happened? In Europe, there was a crisis of faith as a result of Darwin's publication of On the Origin of Species. The intellectuals of the day began to doubt the existence of God, and they believed that the science of the day was disproving a need for God. We will revisit the question of whether or not science says anything that disproves God to this day, some 3 centuries later, and we'll come to some surprising conclusions. But this was the genesis. This was the origins of what we today see as identity politics and social justice and political correctness, and this astonishing resurgence of Marxism, genuine attempts by young people to bring about another communist utopia despite the evidence from history. So, the death of God leads to an interesting crisis. The crisis is this: absent the Judeo-Christian God who tells you what is right and what is wrong, who orients our morality by saying, you are made in the image of God and are therefore inviolable. And that is the basis, that is the heartbeat of our entire morality, and everything works out from that. Take that out of the equation. How do you know what is up or down? What is right? What is wrong? How do you orient a society? How do you rule it? How do you pass laws? How do you understand anything around you? And the best answer that they could come up with was the idea of collectivist equality. And even that idea has a dishonest origin. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, known as the father of modern liberalism, this was a man who wanted to live without God. He wanted to overthrow and put off what he saw as the constraint, the oppression to his person of Judeo-Christian norms and morality. And he did so. He lived in Paris, in Parisian society, as what he called a pre-modern natural man. He was very fond of the phrase, the noble savage. And the noble savage, the pre-natural modern man, had sexual intercourse with anyone that he wished. And he lived according to a moral-free and amoral life structure. Now, the obvious result of this was that he made 4 women pregnant, and all 4 women gave birth to children who Jean-Jacques Rousseau then didn't want to raise. He felt that the fact of fatherhood also oppressed him. But now you have an interesting problem, because this man was the quintessential original version of what we today would call a virtue signaler. He was the man who wrote philosophy about how glorious his own thoughts were and how everyone should try to be like him. And he didn't want to take accountability for his kids, but at the same time, he had to look good in society. So he invented collectivism from whole cloth. He came up with this idea, and it was squarely, historian Paul Johnson, CBE, details the history. It was squarely invented to make his accountability as a parent go away. That is the origin, that is step one in this entire project. And he came up with collectivism. He said, "It should not be my job to raise my children because I have an extraordinary mind. I'm here to teach enlightenment to the masses. Instead, my child should be raised by the village, by everyone, should be the accountability of the entire society." Now, doesn't that just sound so enlightened? Of course, you have to have a mechanism to make this happen, because the society is a very vague concept. Jean-Jacques Rousseau closed the gap for us, and he said the mechanism of the collective will is the state. The state organizes the collective, and they are in charge. In fact, they essentially usurp the role of God. Jean-Jacques Rousseau is actually quite famous for having said that if a dissident, if a human being who did not agree with the collective will, what we might call the will of the mob, was getting in the way, becoming a stumbling block to the will of the state should have the moral right to remove, to assassinate that person. So the father of modern liberalism hands us collectivism and hands us the idea that the state should be the arbiter and that the state should be able to execute anyone who doesn't agree with the general will. That idea led directly to the French Revolution. The French Revolution was the beginning of the bloodshed implied by the idea of collectivism. What was one of the very first things that it did? Deconsecrated the church, and it banned Christianity. Collectivism's first step is always to get rid of Judeo-Christian values. Why? Because they are the antithesis of mob justice. We have this underpinning morality that says every individual is made in the image of God and therefore uniquely valuable. Collectivism says if an individual is getting in the way of the general will, that individual is expendable. They are meaningless carbon and they must be executed. So we have two interesting revolutions that took part at roughly the same time in history, but they had two completely different ideologies. The first one was the revolution in the United States. The second one was the revolution in France. The revolution in the United States led to a founding document that said, we hold these truths to be self-evident. And the idea was that because all men are created equal in the image of their creator, their rights were inviolable. And it's the idea that the rights are not given to you by a state, by a mob, by a general will. Your rights pre-exist any government because they come from God. And that led to one of the most prosperous nations on earth. In many ways, they are contravening this idea today, and we will pick up on that theme a little later on. But that was an exceptionally good idea and led to great prosperity. Across the pond back in Europe, they did the exact opposite. They said our driving ideas are liberty, an interesting word in their hands, equality, fraternity. And that equality idea is always problematic when imposed by the state, because people are not equal, they are different. And under collectivism, they have to be made equal. The same line of thinking was then picked up by a philosopher, a German philosopher, by the name of Karl Marx. And he looked at Rousseau's philosophy and he said, you know, this collectivism, this is an excellent idea. The idea that the general will can supersede the individual and that the state is the mechanism of control with the power of life and death over dissidents. All of that, those are excellent ideas. It just needs one thing. It needs an economic system. And as a result of that, picking up the seeds of Rousseau, who invented this philosophy to get rid of his responsibility for his children. Marx then took the philosophy further and implemented the idea that has been responsible for over 100 million human deaths by government genocide or starvation, the biggest body count of any ideology in human history. The Wall Street Journal calls it the greatest catastrophe our species has ever faced. Let's jump back for a second. What happened to Rousseau's kids? All 4 of them went into state institutions, and all 4 of them died young. And Rousseau was not present at any of their deaths. That was the seed. That was the beginning of this type of thinking. And to this day, Jean-Jacques Rousseau is hailed as the father of modern liberalism. And this is the philosophy that gives rise to political correctness. It gets handed over to Karl Marx. Karl Marx calls it communism. It goes to Russia, and the Russian government publishes publications that say, you should be politically correct for the greater good. And it's always sold about being for the greater good. Because remember, you cannot sell it as evil. You have to sell counterfeit morality. You have to do a duplicitous version of good. Otherwise, no one buys into it. This then has various results around the world. This type of thinking being carried out in this Russian experiment leads to one of the greatest body counts and death counts in human history. It goes to China as well, where they rack up the single biggest human catastrophe of any nation in all of human history, contributing to that over 100 million death count. Now, in the United States, something very interesting happens. The idea of socialist Marxism, viewed from the outside, is clearly not working. And the folks who want socialist Marxism, who want this collectivism, decide that they need to force it. And how do you force a concept like this in a place like the United States, which is the most prosperous nation in the world? Well, there are several things that you can do. When you view the economic theory failing catastrophically, all you do is you change the underpinnings and you keep fighting for revolution. Enter a group called the Frankfurt School. The Frankfurt School is possibly the group most responsible for our modern-day incarnation of political correctness. They took Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Karl Marx's legacy and they repackaged it and handed it on to the youth. Here's what they decided to do. Instead of fighting for economic Marxism, the kind that says all history is the history of class struggle, they said, we'll repackage it so that all history is the history of demographic struggle. White against black, straight against gay. Pick a group and set them against one another. Male against female. All is hostility, all is unending war between groups. If over the past 10, 20 years, you've started to notice this identity politics, this idea of one group as the oppressor, the other group as the victim, and these strange ideas about who is allowed to speak on a certain topic and who is not, and who must be deplatformed because of their race, gender, demography, you are dealing with the seeds of the Frankfurt School. So they took this economic theory and they changed it into a cultural one. Their stated goal was to undermine the Judaeo-Christian tradition in the United States of America. Why America? Because it is iconic for Western civilization. If you can destroy it there, it can spread outward. So the Frankfurt School then employed ideas by people, thinkers like Foucault. Foucault had an interesting take on this postmodernist Marxist mess. He came to the idea, very much a collectivist idea, that there is no such thing as good or bad, there are only masks for power. And he did something very interesting to academia. Now, of course, if you can undermine academia, you can teach these ideas to the youth, and that is always the goal. So what he did in his particular case was he said, there is no such thing as morality, there is no such thing as good or bad, there is only power and oppression. And if you understand that one framework, that one lens for viewing the world, you already understand much of modern identity politics and political correctness. It's not about who's right. It's not about who is wrong. It's not about legality, and it's not about morality. Everything is power and oppression, and you see the entire world through that lens. Foucault is the man most cited in the humanities departments today. Of all the minds teaching your children at a university level, Foucault is the most quoted. His ideas are extraordinary. They are dark, they are in many appreciable ways flat out evil, but they are prevailing in academia today. A number of institutes have observed that since the fall of the Soviet Union, modern campuses, modern university campuses and colleges represent the single highest concentration of Marxist ideology remaining in the world. So that's a very quick history of how this entire thing worked. It starts with Rousseau. Rousseau doesn't want morality, doesn't want to raise his kids, invents collectivism. Collectivism is picked up by Karl Marx and is turned into communism. When it doesn't prevail in the West, the Frankfurt School attacks the culture of the West and tries to bring in cultural rather than economic Marxism. And that leaves us with the nightmarescape of a politically correct future, which you and I are currently in the town hall trying to face, trying to understand, and trying to oppose. What happens if all of this prevails? The simple answer is the next generation will be forbidden from teaching the Bible. First thing that was banned in Russia. First thing that was deconsecrated in France after their revolution. The first thing they get rid of is Christian doctrine. I've been working my way through a chilling book called The Gulag Archipelago by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. And I don't recommend it if you want to keep your smile up, but it is extraordinary in the sense of detailing how mundane evil can become under socialist systems. And quite interestingly, he talks about folks going into the Gulag and how people who went in with their faith still intact actually did a great deal better than those who went in, as he describes it, spiritually disarmed. And here's something else that we don't really think about. He says, you prepare your faith before the gates close behind you. If you haven't done it by then, it is too late. We are living at the moment in a period of some degree of peace and of some degree of prosperity, and it is very easy to become lax with our faith. In times when the gates close behind you, it is already too late. You go in there spiritually armed or you go in there spiritually disarmed. And he also makes the other interesting point. We think that one day we can simply pick up the faith when we need it. He says, the children of people who were raised without a strength of faith were more easily recruited to evil. Now that should mean a great deal to us. Before the gates close behind your children, if that is ever to happen to us, and this force is fighting for it, will your children be easily recruited to evil on the grounds that they have been spiritually disarmed? The universities, make no mistake, are working on that project, and they are doing it in hardcore, passionate, and focused ways. We could spend a great deal of time talking about the universities. How does the ideology advance today? This talk is based on my new book called Political Correctness Does More Harm Than Good. And the subtitle is How to Identify, Debunk, and Dismantle Politically Correct Ideas. And the idea is not just to know the history, but to understand how you can engage with the philosophy, how you can debunk it, how you can debate it, how you can put your hand up and say to the man on the stage representing dialectic materialism, here is why your system is wrong, evil, and doomed to failure. Here is why we do not submit our children to live according to this awful new philosophy. Here are some of the ways that it advances. The first one, and I think this is the one we most need to understand, is that it poses as kindness. It poses as social justice, and its mechanism thereafter is to find the oppressed and to side with them. And everything about that sounds good. And yet, in every case, it ends up directly opposing Christianity. The idea of extending kindness to sexual demographics like the LGBTQ groups may sound initially like a kind thing to do. Folks, in California today, there are serious discussions about banning the Bible. Banning the Bible in California in the United States of America. Did you ever think you would hear that in your lifetime? It's coming, and it is coming quickly, and it is picking up in aggression because it is not afraid. Not an insufficient number of people are actively and dramatically opposing it because we fear the mob. Number one, it poses as kindness. Number two, it alters definitions. Definitions, the understanding of words and how things are defined, is incredibly important to our understanding of the world. We, as proponents of the Judeo-Christian tradition, believe that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and nothing that was created without the Word. And this is a topic that we can go into a great deal of depth on as well. But word matters. It is at the core, it is one of the fundamental building blocks of all creation and of all good creation. Altering definitions is a very powerful technique for the advancement of political correctness. Take, for example, the idea of gender dysphoria. Here is one that is a hot-button topic right at the moment. Can a man be a woman? Can a woman be a man? Are the ideas interchangeable? Up until 2018 going into 2019, medical councils around the world used the term gender dysphoria. They took the term out of their medical books. Why? Was there a new discovery? Was there a medical development that pointed out that this was not a biological or a medical issue? The answer is no. There was simply advocacy against it. There were no changes in our medical understanding, but there were changes in the politics. Words and definitions are incredibly important in this particular zone of combat. Number three, repression via tolerance, or what a thinker named Marcuse called inclusion through exclusion. Now that sounds a little complicated. Allow me to unpack that one for you. Herbert Marcuse is one of the far left radicals whose goal, as per the Frankfurt School, is to dismantle Judeo-Christian norms and to bring in cultural Marxism. And one of the things that he teaches is that universities and places of learning, and increasingly businesses as well, should include through exclusion. The idea is you include everything, that includes everything, but you exclude anything that doesn't tolerate everything. Folks, are there things that Christianity cannot and should not tolerate? Well, that makes Christianity intolerant. And by that manner, it should be excluded. I'll give you a very extreme but simple example of how this works in academia. It is anti-science. If you have a basic understanding of the scientific principle, it essentially goes like this. A person proposes a thesis, proposes an idea. Then you try to falsify the thesis, and you test it, and you attack it, and whatever remains, whatever prevails after a process of falsification is held to be contingent truth. That knowledge prevails. And that is how science works. For a couple of thousand years, that is how Western philosophy, Judeo-Christian tradition, and science have all understood knowledge and academia. Herbert Marcuse inverts that. He says anything that is embedded must be rejected from the get-go. Now, embedded is really a code word for vetted. If an idea has endured for 2,000 years, it means that it is a good idea. It has prevailed through the natural process of scientific selection. Herbert Marcuse says no. If it is embedded, that means it is ideologically sinister and must be pushed aside. Herbert Marcuse says we should engage with the radical only. Forget the embedded ideas, which are sinister because they've been proving themselves to work for a couple of millennia. And he says what we should do is exclude anything that is intolerant. So in principle, and this is an extreme example, if I have a psychic who tells me that her dead cat spirit says the following. And I weigh that academically against a scientist who says, no, that is not true, this is true. Then per Herbert Marcuse's model of inclusion through exclusion or repressive tolerance, we must get rid of the scientist, because he is the one who is being exclusionary to the psychic. And all of that only makes sense if you believe in postmodernism, this idea of multiple truths, this Marxist socialist idea that says there is no truth, there's no up, no down, no right, no wrong, there are many competing truths. Folks, we believe that there is a truth, a way, a life, and it is singular. If you do not define truth in the singular, then there is no such thing as truth. This is why I say, and I stand by the idea, that this competing ideology is the antithesis of our Judeo-Christian tradition. We believe in truth as a singular concept. They like to speak about his truth, her truth, their truth, but never the truth. Speaking the truth is our greatest weapon against political correctness in every forum. Number 4, revising history. In places like the United States of America, again, an icon for Western culture built on Judeo-Christian traditions, up until about the 1960s, 1970s, most people loved their nation because they were raised to love their nation. They were raised by generations who were capable of transmitting the underpinning value systems of a Judeo-Christian tradition. Then from the 1960s, the Frankfurt School moves in and starts to dismantle that. And one of their greatest tools is revisionist history. One of the worst examples of that one is called A People's History of the United States. People's History of the United States is a Marxist propaganda version of America's history. And it's the most extraordinary thing. I'll give you just one example. In the opening chapter, so the book tells the story of Columbus discovering America. And it quotes a part of his diary in which he looks at the natives and he says something down the lines of, these people look battered, they look bruised, they look like they've been through some sort of a war or a battle, and they look like they could be easily enslaved. And in A People's History of America, the author cites this as though that proves that slavery was the founding impulse of America. Now go read the books debunking A People's History of America. And you'll find that what actually happened was that Christopher Columbus was talking about how this one group of Indians had been at war with another group of Indians, how they had been in battle with them, how they looked beleaguered, and how he was worried that that group could take this group as slaves. Now that is an incredibly dishonest representation of history. How seriously is it being taken? The New York Times has launched a thing called the 1619 Project. The idea is to redefine the founding date of the United States of America. To define it not based on the day that it was founded by Americans as we understand it, but based on the arrival of the first slave. Why is that important? Well, because if you can make the entire project of the United States a shameful enterprise, you get to attack, you get to undermine, you get to discredit what remains as one of the standing icons of a successful Judeo-Christian nation. It matters to the Marxist mindset to undo nations like the United States. They're teaching it to the children, and their own children are swallowing it. You see these riots and these marches, and particularly in places like Portland, Oregon, and you see American children holding up the hammer and sickle and calling for communism and talking about the shame of America and how the whole enterprise must be overthrown. What on earth is going on? Started 3 centuries ago, it's still being rolled out today. We just don't know the history, and we don't connect the dots. Revisionist history is one of their greatest tools. Number 5, inverting morality. Good is bad, up is down. Light is dark, good is evil. That is the entire project here. You have to take all things that the Judeo-Christian God tells us are good and sacrosanct and make them shameful. You have to take all things that seem right to man and elevate them. Of course, we know that the ends thereof are death. What are the battlefronts today? There are several. And we can go into depth and detail, and I'd actually like to do that with you in further lectures on each one. Take, for example, the economic battlefront. Aside from this particular book, I've written several books that debunk politically correct ideas about wealth and money against what actually causes human beings to prosper under states of liberty and of freedom and of free trade. Free trade, identified even by atheist thinkers like Steven Pinker as one of the greatest peacekeeping forces in human history. It means we have to serve one another, and we have to do so repeatedly, so you can't cheat people. It doesn't work on an ongoing basis if you are dishonest or unethical. The folks who prosper are the ones who serve one another incredibly well. The opposite of that, of course, is Marxism. It's the collectivist idea that all things belong to the state tells you what to do. And to, I think, the great astonishment of anyone who knows the history of Marxism, this force is resurgent today. And in one of my books that is subtitled, How to Debunk Terrible Wealth Ideas, I talk about what I call a tale of two Thomases. There is an economist who I deeply respect, and there is one who I think is one of the greatest forces for societal damage in the world today. And by a quirk of fate, they both happen to be named Thomas. The one is Thomas Piketty. You've come across him. If you've ever heard of the phrase, the 1%, or you've ever come across the book Thomas Piketty's Capital in the 21st Century, then you know who we are talking about here. This man is incredibly influential. Governments listen to him. Policymakers listen to him. And his entire idea, in a nutshell, is this. Capital has been accumulating in the hands of the top 1% over long periods of time. As a result of that, other people are denied capital. And what we really need to do is we need governments to take over all of the capital and to redistribute it. It's pure Marxism. It's pure Marxism, but it is dressed up in modern language and modern ideas. Go and see how many books have been written debunking Thomas Piketty's Capital in the 21st Century. But then try this project. Walk into any bookstore. See if you can find the original. It's there on the shelves. Now see if the books debunking the factual errors, the philosophical errors, the economic errors, all of the errors are anywhere to be found. You won't find them. Why? It's as though the original lie has been allowed to prevail. Now, on the other side of that, I quite strongly recommend listening to some of the audio books, absorbing some of the thinking of Thomas Sowell. Thomas Sowell is an American economist. He was born in Harlem. He started off as a radical Marxist. Then he grew up, saw the error of his ways, and spent the next 50 or so years fighting against Marxism. He is the author of several best-selling books, and his entire thing is this. And if you understand this one principle, you will understand how Marxism fails in the modern world and how to debunk it, just through this one framework. He says, test a thing by its outcome, not its kindly sounding intentions. Here's a practical example of this. Thomas Sowell is himself a black man. He speaks about black poverty rates in the United States of America. And he says the popular politically correct narrative is that if we have differences in earning, in income in America today, it is because of the legacy of slavery from X years ago. He says nonsense. He says coming out of emancipation, the material wealth of black America was on a strong upward trajectory. There were places in the United States where the black income was higher than the median income for white Americans. And all of that lasted right up to and stopped at the 1960s. What happened in the 1960s? Liberal Democrat Lyndon B Johnson declared war on poverty. And what he did was he massively enlarged the welfare state. And he massively enlarged social systems by which money is simply given to the poorest of the poor. And what it did was it halted black economic growth in its tracks. It stopped dead. And the mechanism for that was to incentivize young girls to wed the state. Now remember from Rousseau, the state must be all-powerful. If you are independent of the state, you are falling afoul of, you are an anomaly to a collectivist system. And that can't be permitted if our goal is socialist Marxism. So what he does is he massively expands the welfare state, and young black teenage girls are financially incentivized to fall pregnant and get a grant from the state. They are also incentivized not to have a husband in their lives. If they have the husband, they don't get the grant to the same extent. This incentivizes family breakdown. The war on poverty decimated the black American family, and it also massively harmed their financial rise. Now, what Thomas Sowell does is he goes around the world, decade by decade, cause by cause, idea by idea, and he points out how politicians talk about kindness, talk about how this will help people, and how we fall for it every time. He says if we had to judge the thing by its outcome, not its kindly sounding intentions, we would never again fall for these projects. That is the economic battlefront, and it's one that I'm particularly interested in. I've written several books on it, and I'd love to do a longer talk for you on that one topic. There are also some interesting ideas about how Christianity interacts with prosperity, with free trade, and so forth, and how Marxism does the exact opposite, of course, going in the opposite direction to Judaeo-Christian principles. Here, sticking with economics, let me give you an interesting little phrase here. And I wonder if you've heard this kind of phraseology before. Take a look at the slide and this quotation. So there you see two people that the youth very much support, and the latest stat that I saw said that something like 75% of American youth believe in socialism and want that as the way forward. Take a look at the quote on the screen. "We are socialists. We are enemies of today's capitalistic economic system for the exploitation of the economically weak. With its unfair salaries, with its unseemly evaluation of a human being according to wealth and property, and we are determined to destroy this system under all conditions." Now, folks, I've lied to you. This slide is a cheat. The quote is correct, but that's the guy who said it. I want you to think about that for just a second. That is the man who said that quote. Does it not sound exactly like what the youth in places like Portland, Oregon are saying is the glorious new way forward? It's very easy to view history and to see the aftermath of an evil man like Adolf Hitler, and to cavalierly, glibly say things like, "I would never have gone along with it. I would never have participated." Folks, that is the philosophy on which it arose, and most of the youth believe in it. That's the degree of the problem that we are facing. That's the economic battlefront. Here's the next one. The next battlefront is sexual, and that one is a big deal. Sex, of course, in the Judeo-Christian tradition is something that is meant to be sacrosanct. It is meant to be revered, reverenced. It has terms and conditions that come with it. Jewish commentator Dennis Prager wrote an award-winning essay on how the moral sexual revolution of the Judaic tradition put the genie of sex back into the bottle, and was one of the greatest contributors to clarity of thinking for human beings, to productivity, and to good moral living in every sense. And he goes into a bit of detail on that. In older pagan societies, sex ruled everything, and everything was ruled by sex. And the Judeo-Christian tradition was the first moral system to put it into something contained, something that could be managed, something that actually reverenced women. He makes the argument that it even led to modern romance, which would not have occurred absent the Judeo-Christian system. Our God is a God of categories, and I think there's a mistake that we make, particularly within the Christian tradition, in not reading the Old Testament. Now, we are under a new covenant, but folks, it's the same God. If we don't believe it's the same God, we have a problem on our hands. We undo the entire thing. And I think there's something strange about not finding out what our God is like. And we meet him for the first time in the Old Testament. There is much to learn there. Dennis Prager, again, a Jewish commentator, of course, speaks about how in the Torah, our God is very interested in categories and the separation of categories. Night from day, good from evil, life from death, the priests in the Old Testament were not permitted to touch a cadaver because they were the symbolic representation of life, and that, of course, represented death, male from female. These categories, for reasons we may not even understand, matter to God. Today, the modern politically correct project, of course, is to get rid of these categories. And we see things like what you're seeing over there, a transgender man reading to a child, and the idea that this is all so wonderful, it is all so normal. Sexual, that is one of the great battlefronts for political correctness. The next one is social. And here, I'd like to give you just the tail end of something that is worth studying and worth learning, because for the last 50 years, it has been used against Christians, against what we might call classical liberals, against conservatives, against people who believe in the Judaeo-Christian tradition to devastating effect. There's a man named Saul Alinsky, and he wrote a book called Rules for Radicals. There are 13 rules for radicals. And Saul Alinsky's book is designed to attack and undermine us. If you haven't heard of the book and if you haven't read the book, what does that say about our preparedness to face this cultural usurper? There are 13 rules for radicals. I'll give you just 2 examples. The first rule for radicals by which to destroy us, to get rid of the Judeo-Christian moral pillars that get in the way of collectivism, is that the action is in the reaction. What could that mean? It means that what you've got to do is you've got to find someone, pick on them, and wait to see what they do, and use their own reaction to destroy them. Here's another rule for radicals, and it goes, pick the target, freeze it, personalize it, and polarize it. Here's an example from South Africa from just a few weeks ago. There's a school in Brackenfell, and like many of the schools during lockdown, they have been shut down. They're not allowed to have things like class gatherings. They're not allowed to have an end-of-year party. Bunch of guys from the school get together and they decide they're going to have an event. Now, it turned out that this group of friends happened to be an all-white demographic. Now, folks, just to be very clear, the opposing politically correct ideology is not in favor of any demography or any racial group. The idea is to uphold Judeo-Christian principles. We fight for black, we fight for white, we fight for every human being made in the image of God, and that's important. In this particular case, it happened to be a group of white kids, and the EFF, our radical Marxist group, hears about this and they decide that this is a racist event because there are no black kids present. So what do? They pick the target, they freeze it. In other words, they separate it out from the rest of society. Pick your deer out of the herd and separate it. They personalize it and they polarize it. And on national news and even some international news channels, they go there and they riot against that school day after day after day. Why? Well, because the action is in the reaction. Let's see what the school does back. And if you read Alinsky, he's a proponent of ends justify the means morality. He says it doesn't matter if you accuse them of something that is true. Accuse the church of being homophobic. Accuse this Christian of doing that. It doesn't matter if it's true or not. Wait to see how they react. Then you can take them down based on the reaction. Did you know that? Did you know that that is a tool, a learned tool used by Marxists to tear down our tradition? If you're aware of it, you can prevail against it. You need to know Alinsky's rules for radicals in order to be able to oppose them. That is my goal. I aim to arm you with ideas like that so that it doesn't destroy the underpinnings of our morality. The next battlefront is educational, and this is an extraordinary one. If you get the chance, I'd love you to read a book called The Coddling of the American Mind by Jonathan Haidt and co-author. And he points out in The Coddling of the American Mind that from the Greek era, the invention of what we might refer to today as universities, up until the year 2000 and slightly beyond, the idea of a university was to challenge the human mind. Something changed in this generation, and it changed radically, dramatically, and seemingly overnight. Today, you hear varsity students talking about how an idea might traumatize them. They will not allow a conservative speaker onto a stage in certain Californian universities and certain places around the world, and they will riot against such speakers. Now, a conservative speaker is someone who upholds the tradition of our civilization for the last 2,000 years. That, they say, traumatizes them. Where do we get this idea of learned trauma? Jonathan Haidt points out it is being taught to the next generation. Why is it being taught? What's the point of raising fragile, broken on purpose young people? Well, the answer is you need to draw together, you need to recruit from a fund of groups of people who perceive themselves as victims. Remember the Frankfurt School. You take all of the dispossessed, you take every group that is in some way radical, and you arm them, you weaponize them, and you aim them against Christianity. And it doesn't matter who the groups are. The groups could, in theory, be opposed to one another. Take the gay advocacy groups and the pro-Islam groups. How on earth do those two ever get together? Yet they do, because their common enemy is Christianity. Frankfurt School. The Frankfurt School taught them to do that. And today we are teaching children how to be mentally fragile so that they can be victims. They are taught that these ideas, Judaeo-Christian tradition, our civilization, everything underpinning what holds us together, is traumatizing to them, and that if they're exposed to it, they must go and run away to a safe space. Haidt points out that as a psychologist, if your goal is to teach people mental strength, mental agility, mental endurance, you teach them all the opposite things to what is being taught at a modern university today. If you want to create fragile, broken human beings, if you want to do that to your children, that's how you do it. Folks, are you happy to volunteer your money to have your child taught fragility in order to become a Marxist, so that they can be weaponized against the Judeo-Christian tradition? Is that okay with you? There's a war to be fought here, and it's an important one. The next battlefront, of course, is directly religious. And we have a lot of these ideas being taught into the church, and this troubles me, and it troubles me greatly. I think of one progressive preacher, a man who regularly tries to teach the ways of the world into the church instead of the other way around. We are called to teach holiness out into the world, not to teach the ways of the world into the church. The ways of the world seem right to us, the ends thereof are death. And I observed the same gentleman once making an argument that the God of the Old Testament was a capricious, violent village god, a tribal god, and we didn't need to pay too much attention to what he said. Of course, the genius in that is, if you don't believe he is Almighty God, then the predictions in the Old Testament about a coming Messiah disappear. If those disappear, so does the legitimacy of Jesus Christ, our Lord and Savior. You can't have that. He is either Almighty God or he isn't. Now, I suspect that in this man's mind, he views Jesus as a good teacher, a kindly, clever man who spoke about kindness. I think we view him as the way, the truth, and the light, and the Son of God. And I think unless we stick to our guns on that one, we allow that rot into the church, and we can't do it. If a usurping force is trying to tear down the pillars of our morality, are we armed to resist it? Or are we welcoming it in? It's a terrifying idea. Is there hope? Well, of course there is. Here's something that I think is quite interesting. We view all of this, and it's very easy if you have been trained in biblical ideas about the end times. It's very easy to look at all of this and to say, well, there's no hope. It's all leading to one world order. It's all leading to apocalypse. It's all leading to the end of things. There's nothing we can do about it. Here's why I think that is the wrong response. In places like Soviet Russia, it did not lead to the end of the world, but it did lead to 100 years of death for their children. We must fight it every step of the way. We cannot be lax about this on the grounds that this is the inevitable unfolding of history and it can't be opposed. Folks, we surrender our children at their peril. We have to fight. Of course there's hope. Here are 5 ways to fight it very quickly. The first one, and it's the most obvious one, speak the truth. Speak the truth on every matter. When you see the mob praising the emperor's new clothes, and the emperor's not wearing anything, be the little boy who raises his hands and says so. It matters that we speak the truth. This rot, this evil, this politically correct doctrine only prevails if no one speaks the truth. Speaking the truth is our biggest weapon against it, and we have to do it all the time. Number 2, know the history of their ideas. I'll give you just one example of how powerful this can be. You've heard the politically correct phrase, gender is a social construct. There's no such thing as male and female anymore. And of course, the contradiction there is some boys are born in a girl's body and some girls are born in a boy's body, but also there's no such thing as male and female. One of those has to be wrong because they are mutually incompatible. Do you know the history of that idea? I'll share it with you. It's one of the most evil, fraudulent scientists you have ever encountered. His name was John Money. John Money decided that he wanted to test this hypothesis that a boy could be raised as a girl and vice versa, that gender was just a social construct. It had nothing to do with genetics, it had nothing to do with your sexual parts, your makeup, your chromosomes, anything. It was just a social construct. Something happened that caught his attention. A family had 2 boys, and one of the boys had a botched circumcision. His penis was burnt off. So John Money approached this family and he said, "Let me run this experiment with your child. We will raise him as a girl." And they agreed. They surgically removed his testicles, they put him into dresses. From a very young age, he tried to take his dresses off. He didn't want to be wearing them, but his parents insisted. His parents tried to get him to sit on the toilet whenever he went to the toilet. His older brother was standing. He didn't like it. He thought of himself as a boy. His parents insisted he had to go ahead with it. John Money got the 2 brothers, the boy and the girl, to interact with one another in sexual ways, to do sexual role-playing with the male as dominant and the mutilated female as submissive. Sexual role-playing between the 2 brothers. I'll pause you here for a second. I'm going to ask you, do you think this man is evil? Do you think this represents child abuse? Most people don't know this history. As a result of this experiment, John Money declared his project, declared his enterprise an academic success. He told the world that he had proven that gender is a social construct. The first boy, the older brother, overdosed on drugs and killed himself. The second boy put a shotgun in his own mouth and took his own life. That's John Money's success for you. That is the case on which the science is settled. If you ask an evolutionary biologist, are the genders interchangeable? They will laugh at you. They will say no. But if you ask someone with a PhD from the sociology department, is gender a social construct? They'll say yes, the science proves it. That is the science that proved it. And it gets baked into each new generation of textbooks. That is the science. That is the history of that politically correct idea. If you know the history of their ideas, you can defeat them with their own internal evil. But you have to know the history of the ideas. There is so much more that we can talk about on this topic. We can go into studies like that. We can go into people like Kinsey and how he corrupted people sexually and the fraudulence of his science. We can go into all of the things that are discussed as known ideas or settled science. We can go into the economics, and I'd love to go into each one with you. And that's a very quick overview course. What is modern political correctness? It starts with the original liberal, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who didn't want morality, and then didn't want to raise his children, and invented collectivism. He identified the state as the mechanism of control. Karl Marx picked that up, turned it into communism. When communism didn't catch on in the States, the Frankfurt School said, let's turn it into a social project. They are teaching it to your kids in the universities today with the goal of destroying the Judeo-Christian underpinnings of Western civilization. Unless we know it, unless we know how to identify it, debunk it, and dismantle it, it will prevail. Speak the truth and you will prevail against it. And I think our God is stronger than any social system. Political correctness is a socially constructed idea. It can be socially deconstructed by anyone who is brave enough to do so. Step number 1, you have to speak the truth. Folks, where to from here? I'd love it if you would help me out by subscribing to the YouTube channel in which I share these ideas. The more I can get them out there, the more effective we become. The channel on YouTube is called Breaking Woke, as in woke identity politics, Breaking Woke. There's a site called breakingwoke.com where I aggregate all of this information. The YouTube channel is Breaking Woke. The book is now available globally. In South Africa, we don't have the paperback here yet, but we do have the ebook and the audio book read by the original author. And I would be most honored if you would download that and learn the arguments against political correctness. It's our future, it's our children at stake. It's an ideology that has to be defeated. Thank you so much for your time.